Tyler Anderson had nothing. His shoes were held together with duct tape. His lunch was yesterday's leftover rice, and his single mother worked double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads. Every morning, he walked through the crumbling hallways of Lincoln Elementary with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that dignity was all he had left. But Tyler possessed something far more valuable than money or status. He had a heart that couldn't ignore suffering, even when he was suffering himself. When he noticed the school janitor going without food, Tyler made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. He shared his meager lunch with a man he barely knew, asking for nothing in return. The janitor accepted the gift with trembling hands and tears in his eyes, as if that simple container of rice was worth more than gold. Tyler had no way of knowing that his small act of kindness had just set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of corporate fraud, bring down a criminal empire, and ultimately lead to the most shocking revelation of his young life. 3 weeks later, a gleaming Rolls-Royce pulled up to Tyler's rundown apartment building. The man who stepped out was not the man Tyler thought he knew. He was someone else entirely, someone with the power to change Tyler's life forever. But the real shock wasn't who the man was. It was what Tyler's simple generosity had already accomplished behind the scenes. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the most extraordinary consequences. Sometimes giving away your lunch changes everything. This is the story of how one boy's compassion triggered a series of events so incredible, so perfectly orchestrated by the universe itself, that it proves karma doesn't just exist, it has a sense of justice that never forgets. The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 in the morning, piercing through the thin walls of the Anderson apartment. Jennifer Anderson jolted awake, her heart racing as reality crashed down on her like a cold wave. Another day, another battle to survive. She stumbled through the cramped kitchen, stepping over a loose floorboard that had been threatening to give way for months. The refrigerator hummed loudly, a constant reminder of how empty it usually was. Jennifer opened it and stared at the meager contents: a half-empty carton of milk, some leftover rice from 2 days ago, and a single apple that had seen better days. 12-year-old Tyler was still asleep in the next room, curled up under a blanket that had more holes than fabric. Jennifer watched him for a moment, her chest tightening with the familiar ache of a mother who couldn't provide everything her child deserved. His school clothes were clean but worn thin, patched in places where the knees had given out from too much wear. Jennifer worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner downtown, serving coffee and pancakes to people who tipped in loose change when they bothered to tip at all. Her hands were permanently stained from years of handling hot plates and scrubbing grease. Her back ached from standing 14 hours a day, but she never complained. Not in front of Tyler, anyway. She carefully measured out the rice, adding just enough water to make it stretch. This would be Tyler's lunch today, packed in a container that once held store-bought cookies from better times. Jennifer had become an expert at making nothing look like something, at turning scraps into meals that would keep her son going through another school day. Tyler stirred as the morning light filtered through their apartment window. He never complained about their situation, never asked why other kids had brand-name sneakers, while his were held together with duct tape. He just smiled that crooked smile that reminded Jennifer of his father, the man who had promised them the world, and then disappeared when reality became too heavy to carry. "Morning, Mom," Tyler said, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was small for his age, all elbows and knees, with hair that stuck up in impossible directions no matter how much Jennifer tried to tame it. "Morning, sweetheart. I packed your lunch." "The usual," Jennifer said, trying to keep her voice light. The usual meant rice with whatever seasoning they had left, maybe a piece of fruit if they were lucky. Tyler nodded and got ready for school without complaint. He understood their situation better than any 12-year-old should have to. He had learned not to ask for the things other kids took for granted, had learned to be grateful for what they had instead of longing for what they couldn't afford. Lincoln Elementary School was a 15-minute walk through a neighborhood that had seen better decades. Tyler made this journey every morning, passing abandoned storefronts and houses with boarded windows. The school itself was old, built in the 1960s when the area was thriving. Now it served kids from families like his, families who were fighting just to keep their heads above water. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and old textbooks. Tyler's sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as he made his way to his locker. He was used to being invisible here, just another face in a sea of kids who understood what it meant to go without. But there was one person at Lincoln Elementary who saw Tyler, really saw him. Robert Harrison had been working as the night janitor for 3 years, arriving after the students left and staying until the morning crew took over. Most people looked right through him, treating him like part of the furniture, but Tyler always nodded when they passed in the halls. Robert was 67 years old, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. His janitorial uniform was always clean and pressed, his work boots polished despite the nature of his job. There was something different about Robert, something that didn't quite fit with the image of a school custodian. He moved with a quiet dignity, spoke with the careful precision of someone who had once commanded boardrooms instead of pushing mop buckets. But Robert Harrison harbored secrets that would have shocked anyone who bothered to look beyond the surface. 3 years ago, he had been the CEO of Harrison Industries, a manufacturing empire worth over $2 billion. He had built that company from nothing, starting in a garage and growing it into a powerhouse that employed thousands of people across the country. Then Bradley Thompson happened. Bradley had been Robert's business partner and closest friend for 20 years. They had built Harrison Industries together, shared victories, and weathered storms side by side. Robert trusted Bradley with everything, which made the betrayal cut deeper than any knife could have. Bradley had been secretly siphoning money from the company for years, cooking the books and hiding his tracks with the skill of someone who understood the system from the inside. When the SEC investigation hit, Bradley had already positioned himself to emerge clean while Robert took the fall for crimes he didn't commit. The legal battles had drained Robert's personal fortune. His reputation was destroyed. His name became synonymous with corporate fraud in every business publication in the country. His wife Patricia, who had been battling cancer during the worst of it, couldn't handle the stress and public humiliation. She died 6 months after the scandal broke, her last words to Robert being an apology for not being strong enough to weather the storm with him. Their son Michael had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, leaving Robert and Patricia with only each other. When Patricia passed, Robert found himself completely alone in a world that had branded him a criminal. He lost the mansion, the cars, the vacation homes, everything that had once defined his success. But Robert Harrison was not a man who gave up easily. He took the janitor job at Lincoln Elementary because it was where Patricia had taught for 10 years before they could afford for her to stop working. Walking these halls every night, Robert felt close to her memory, could almost hear her voice echoing in the empty classrooms where she had shaped young minds with patience and love. The job also gave Robert something he had lost in the corporate world: invisibility. As a janitor, he could observe and plan without anyone paying attention to him. He was working quietly behind the scenes, gathering evidence of Bradley's continued crimes, building a case that would eventually bring justice and restore his name. Tyler first noticed Robert on a Tuesday morning in October. The janitor was finishing his shift, emptying trash cans in the hallway as students began arriving for the day. Most kids pushed past him without acknowledgement, but Tyler paused and nodded respectfully. Robert was surprised by the gesture, surprised that a child would see him as worthy of recognition. Over the following weeks, Tyler and Robert developed an unlikely friendship built on small moments and mutual respect. Tyler would say good morning when they passed in the halls, and Robert would ask about his classes or comment on the weather. These brief conversations became the highlight of Robert's long, lonely nights. Robert began to notice things about Tyler that others missed. The boy's clothes were clean but obviously secondhand, his shoes held together with tape and determination. Tyler never bought lunch in the cafeteria, always carrying a small container from home. Robert recognized the signs of a family struggling to make ends meet because he had been there himself, back in the early days before Harrison Industries became successful. One morning in late November, Robert was running behind schedule. He had spent most of the night in the school library, using the computer to research legal precedents for his case against Bradley. The cleaning supplies sat untouched in his cart as he dozed fitfully in the janitor's closet, his back aching from sleeping in a chair. Tyler arrived at school that morning to find Robert slumped over his desk in the main office, looking exhausted and defeated. The janitor's usual composure had cracked, revealing glimpses of the pain he carried beneath the surface. "Are you okay, Mr. Robert?" Tyler asked, using the name he had heard other staff members call the janitor. Robert looked up, startled. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, using what little money he had to pay for internet access at the public library where he conducted his legal research. His pride prevented him from asking for help, and his isolation made it easy to pretend that skipping meals was a choice rather than a necessity. "I'm fine, son. Just tired," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tyler studied the older man's face, recognizing something familiar in Robert's eyes. It was the same look Tyler sometimes caught in his mother's reflection when she thought no one was watching, the look of someone carrying weight that threatened to crush them. That afternoon, Tyler sat in the cafeteria with his usual lunch. Rice seasoned with salt and pepper, packed in a container that had been washed and reused countless times. He ate slowly, making it last, knowing there wouldn't be anything else until dinner if they were lucky. But Tyler couldn't stop thinking about Robert. The janitor had looked so tired, so defeated, and Tyler recognized hunger when he saw it. He had worn that expression often enough to know what it meant. Tyler made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Tyler found Robert cleaning the gymnasium floors before school started. The janitor moved methodically, his movements precise despite his obvious fatigue. Tyler approached carefully, not wanting to startle the older man. "Mr. Robert," Tyler said softly. Robert looked up, surprised to see a student in the building so early. "Tyler, what are you doing here? School doesn't start for another hour." "I wanted to give you something," Tyler said, pulling the container from his backpack. "My mom packed extra rice today. She always makes too much." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Tyler's mother never made extra anything, because they couldn't afford extra. But the boy delivered the falsehood with such genuine kindness that Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Tyler, I can't take your lunch," Robert said, though his stomach growled audibly at the mention of food. "Please," Tyler insisted, setting the container on a nearby bench. "I already ate breakfast. I'm not even hungry." Another lie, delivered with the same gentle conviction. Tyler had learned to stretch the truth when kindness required it, understanding that sometimes dignity mattered more than absolute honesty. Robert stared at the container for a long moment, his pride warring with his hunger and his growing affection for this remarkable child. No one had shown him genuine kindness in 3 years, not since Patricia died and the world turned its back on him. "Your mother raised a good son," Robert said finally, accepting the gift with the gravity it deserved. Tyler smiled, that crooked grin that could light up the darkest corners of the world. She did her best with what she had. As Tyler walked away, Robert opened the container and found rice mixed with small pieces of vegetables, seasoned with care despite the obvious limitations of ingredients. He ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the kindness that had provided it. That simple act of generosity stirred something in Robert that had been dormant for too long. Tyler reminded him of Michael, his son who had possessed that same instinctive kindness, that same ability to see beyond surface appearances to the person underneath. But Tyler's gesture also reminded Robert of what he had lost and what he was fighting to reclaim. This boy, who had so little, had given freely without expectation of reward or recognition. Tyler had seen a fellow human being in need and responded with the kind of pure compassion that Robert had forgotten existed in the world. As Robert finished the last grains of rice, he made a silent promise to himself and to the memory of his wife and son. He would not let Tyler's kindness go unnoticed or unrewarded. Somehow, someway, he would find a way to repay this debt, even if the boy never knew the true impact of his generous heart. The wheels of justice and karma were already turning, set in motion by a 12-year-old boy who gave up his lunch to help a stranger. Robert Harrison returned to his mop and bucket with renewed purpose, knowing that the hardest battles were often won by the smallest acts of human decency. In the distance, Tyler walked toward his classroom, his stomach empty but his heart full, completely unaware that he had just changed the course of 2 lives with a single container of rice. The boy who had nothing had given everything that mattered, and the universe was preparing to take notice. 3 weeks had passed since Tyler first shared his lunch with Robert, and what started as a single act of kindness had evolved into a daily ritual that neither spoke about directly. Every morning, Tyler would find Robert somewhere in the school building and quietly leave his lunch container where the janitor would discover it. Robert had stopped protesting after the first week, understanding that Tyler's generosity came from a place too pure to argue with. Robert had begun timing his work schedule to coincide with Tyler's arrival at school. He found himself looking forward to their brief conversations, the way Tyler's face would light up when he talked about a book he was reading or a project he was working on in class. The boy had an infectious optimism that Robert had thought was extinct in the world, a belief that tomorrow could be better than today despite all evidence to the contrary. But Robert was not the only one paying attention to Tyler's routine. Derek Thompson had been watching the exchanges between the strange kid and the old janitor for over a week now. Derek was 16, tall and athletic, with the kind of confidence that came from growing up in a mansion with every advantage money could buy. His father, Bradley Thompson, was one of the most successful businessmen in the state, and Derek never let anyone forget it. Derek attended Lincoln Elementary's sister school, Roosevelt High, but he often cut classes to hang around the elementary building where his younger cousin attended. It gave him opportunities to feel superior, to look down on kids who didn't have the designer clothes and expensive gadgets that defined his world. Tyler Anderson was exactly the type of kid Derek loved to torment. Small, quiet, obviously poor, and worst of all, genuinely kind in a way that made Derek's own cruelty seem even more petty by comparison. Derek had been planning to corner Tyler for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to remind the little kid exactly where he stood in the social hierarchy. But something else was happening in Derek's world that he didn't understand yet, something that would soon turn his privileged existence upside down and inside out. Bradley Thompson sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the downtown business district, staring out at a city he believed he owned. His desk was mahogany, his suit was custom-tailored, and his shoes cost more than most people made in a month. Bradley had everything he had ever wanted, and it had all been built on the ruins of his former business partner's life. 3 years ago, Bradley had executed the perfect betrayal. He had spent months moving money out of Harrison Industries and into offshore accounts, creating false documentation that would make Robert Harrison look like the mastermind behind a massive embezzlement scheme. When the authorities came looking for answers, Bradley was ready with evidence that painted himself as an innocent victim and Robert as a greedy criminal who had stolen from his own company. The plan had worked flawlessly. Robert lost everything while Bradley emerged not only clean but sympathetic, the loyal partner who had been deceived by his closest friend. Bradley had even shed tears during his testimony, playing the role of the heartbroken business associate who couldn't believe Robert's betrayal. But Bradley Thompson had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. He had gotten away with the crime so completely that he believed he was untouchable. Success had made him arrogant, and arrogance had made him careless. For the past 2 years, Bradley had been skimming money from his new company, Thompson Holdings, using the same techniques he had perfected during his theft from Harrison Industries. He told himself it was just temporary borrowing, that he would replace the money before anyone noticed. But the amounts kept getting larger, and the temptation kept getting stronger. Bradley had developed expensive tastes during his years of stolen wealth. He owned 3 houses, including a beach mansion in the Hamptons and a ski lodge in Colorado. His garage housed a collection of luxury cars that he barely drove, and his wife's jewelry collection could have funded a small country's budget for a year. All of this excess required constant cash flow, more than Thompson Holdings legitimately generated. So Bradley continued his embezzlement, convinced that his previous success meant he was too smart to ever get caught. What Bradley didn't know was that Robert Harrison had never stopped investigating the original theft. Even while working as a janitor, scraping by on minimum wage, and living in a studio apartment that smelled like industrial cleaner, Robert had been building a case that would not only clear his name, but expose Bradley's continued criminal activities. Robert had spent countless hours in the public library, using free internet access to research financial records and legal precedents. He had contacted former Harrison Industries employees who had always suspected the truth, but had been too afraid to speak up during the original investigation. Slowly, methodically, Robert had assembled evidence that told the real story of what had happened to his company. But the breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, Tyler Anderson. Not directly, of course. Tyler had no idea about Robert's true identity or his connection to Bradley Thompson. But Tyler's simple act of kindness had given Robert something he had lost during his darkest days: hope. The boy's generosity had reminded Robert that justice was worth fighting for, that there were still good people in the world who deserved protection from predators like Bradley. With renewed determination, Robert had finally contacted the FBI with his evidence. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez had been skeptical at first, but the documentation Robert provided was comprehensive and damning. Bank records, emails, witness testimonies, and financial analysis that painted a clear picture of Bradley's crimes, both past and present. The investigation had moved quickly once federal agents began examining Thompson Holdings books. Bradley's current embezzlement was so extensive and poorly concealed that even first-year accounting students could have spotted the irregularities. He had been taking money for so long that he had stopped bothering to cover his tracks effectively. Agent Rodriguez had called Robert just that morning with news that made his hands shake with anticipation. Tomorrow, Bradley Thompson would be arrested on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was airtight, and Bradley's world was about to collapse in spectacular fashion. But the real karma was just beginning to unfold. Derek Thompson walked into Lincoln Elementary that afternoon with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He wore designer jeans and shoes that cost more than Tyler's family spent on groceries in 3 months. His plan was simple: find the poor kid, humiliate him in front of other students, and remind everyone present about the natural order of things. Tyler was at his locker, organizing his books for the next day's classes. He moved efficiently, every motion practiced and purposeful. His backpack was worn but clean, his notebooks were secondhand but well-maintained. Everything about Tyler spoke to someone who understood the value of taking care of what little they had. "Hey, charity case," Derek called out, his voice carrying across the hallway with cruel confidence. Tyler looked up, unsure if the older boy was talking to him. He had learned to avoid confrontation when possible, understanding that kids like Derek were looking for reactions they could use as ammunition for further torment. "Yeah, you," Derek continued, stepping closer. "I've been watching you feed the old janitor every day. What is that, some kind of community service project? Feeding the homeless?" A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the prospect of drama. Tyler felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, not for himself but for Robert. The janitor didn't deserve to be called homeless, didn't deserve to have his dignity stripped away by some spoiled kid who thought cruelty was entertainment. "He's not homeless," Tyler said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "He's just hungry sometimes." Derek laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Right. And I'm sure you can totally afford to be giving away food when you're wearing shoes held together with tape." Tyler glanced down at his feet, self-conscious about the duct tape that held his sneakers together. His mother had promised they would get new shoes next month if she could pick up extra shifts at the diner. But next month always seemed to stay just out of reach. "It's not about what I can afford," Tyler said, surprising himself with his boldness. "It's about doing what's right." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Derek felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. This little kid, this nobody from nowhere, was making Derek feel small in a way he had never experienced before. Tyler's quiet dignity was making Derek's cruelty look petty and meaningless. "What's right?" Derek sneered, covering his discomfort with increased aggression. "What's right is knowing your place. You're nobody, understand? Your mom serves food to people like my dad, and you give away your lunch to janitors because you think that makes you special somehow." Tyler straightened his shoulders, and something in his expression changed. The embarrassment was still there, but it was joined by something else, a quiet strength that Derek recognized and immediately wanted to destroy. "I know exactly who I am," Tyler said, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway. "I'm someone who helps people when they need it. What does that make you?" The question hit Derek like a physical blow. He had expected Tyler to crumble, to back down and apologize for existing in Derek's world. Instead, the younger boy was standing his ground with a moral authority that made Derek's wealth and status seem hollow and meaningless. Derek raised his hand, intending to slap Tyler across the face and restore the natural order of things. But before he could strike, a firm hand caught his wrist and held it motionless. Robert Harrison had appeared behind Derek like a ghost, moving with the silence that came from years of janitorial work. The older man's grip was surprisingly strong, and his eyes held a cold fury that made Derek's blood freeze in his veins. "I don't think that's a good idea, young man," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded boardrooms and controlled billion-dollar budgets. Derek tried to pull away, but Robert's grip was unyielding. "Let go of me, old man. Do you know who my father is?" Robert's smile was thin and predatory, containing knowledge that Derek couldn't begin to understand. "As a matter of fact, I do. Bradley Thompson, CEO of Thompson Holdings. Tell me, how is your father doing these days?" Derek was confused by the question and disturbed by the way Robert asked it, as if he knew something Derek didn't. "He's fine. He's successful. He's rich. Everything you'll never be." "Interesting," Robert said, releasing Derek's wrist. You might want to give him a call. I have a feeling his day is about to get very complicated. Derek rubbed his wrist where Robert had gripped it, trying to process the strange interaction. There was something different about the janitor, something that didn't fit with his position or appearance. The way he had spoken about Bradley Thompson suggested familiarity, knowledge, maybe even history. But Derek's confusion was interrupted by the arrival of his own phone, buzzing with an urgent call from his mother. He answered without thinking, stepping away from Robert and Tyler, but remaining within earshot. "Derek, you need to come home right now." His mother's voice was high and panicked, barely controlled hysteria bleeding through the phone speaker. "Something's happened to your father. The FBI, they arrested him at his office. It's all over the news." Derek felt the world tilt sideways, reality shifting in ways his privileged mind couldn't process. "What are you talking about? Dad didn't do anything wrong." "They're saying he stole money," his mother continued, her voice breaking. "Millions of dollars. They froze all our accounts, Derek. Everything's gone. The house, the cars, everything." Derek's phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor as the words echoed in his mind. He looked around the hallway, seeing the faces of students who had witnessed his attempted bullying of Tyler, seeing the quiet satisfaction in Robert's eyes, seeing the concerned compassion in Tyler's expression despite everything Derek had just put him through. "I don't understand," Derek whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Robert picked up Derek's phone and handed it back to him with surprising gentleness. "Your father built his success on someone else's ruin," he said quietly. "But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Actions have consequences, son. Your father's actions and yours." Derek took the phone with shaking hands, his world crumbling around him as he began to understand that everything he had believed about his life was built on lies and stolen money. The designer clothes on his back, the expensive car in the school parking lot, the mansion he called home. All of it had been purchased with money that belonged to someone else. Tyler watched Derek's face cycle through disbelief, understanding, and finally devastation. Despite everything Derek had just tried to do to him, Tyler felt a stab of sympathy for the older boy. He knew what it felt like to have your world turned upside down, to discover that the safety you thought you had was just an illusion. "Derek," Tyler said softly, causing the older boy to look at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm sorry about your dad." The simple statement of sympathy was more devastating to Derek than any cruelty could have been. Here was this kid, this nobody that Derek had just tried to humiliate and assault, offering comfort in Derek's moment of complete destruction. The kindness was so unexpected, so undeserved, that Derek felt tears burning behind his eyes for the first time in years. Robert watched the exchange with something approaching satisfaction. Justice was finally being served, not just through federal courts and criminal charges, but through the simple human interaction between a bully and his intended victim. Tyler's instinctive compassion was teaching Derek a lesson that no amount of wealth or privilege could have provided. "The apple doesn't always fall far from the tree," Robert said, his voice carrying years of pain and betrayal. "But sometimes it rolls far enough away to grow into something different. Something better." Derek looked at Robert with new understanding, recognizing something in the janitor's eyes that he had missed before. "You know my father, don't you? I mean, really know him?" Robert nodded slowly. "Bradley Thompson destroyed my life 3 years ago. Stole my company, ruined my reputation, cost me everything I had built over decades of honest work. My wife died from the stress of it all. I've been working here, planning and waiting for justice to catch up with him." Derek's legs felt weak as the full scope of his father's crimes began to sink in. His dad wasn't just a thief. He was a destroyer of lives, a man who had built their family's happiness on the suffering of others. Everything Derek had ever been proud of was tainted by blood money and broken dreams. "What happens now?" Derek asked, his voice small and lost. "Now your father faces the consequences of his choices," Robert said. "And you get to decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. You can follow his path, or you can choose something different." Tyler stepped closer to Derek, ignoring the fact that the older boy had just tried to hit him. "It's not your fault what your dad did," he said. "You don't have to be like him." Derek looked at Tyler with wonder, unable to comprehend the generosity of spirit that could offer forgiveness and friendship to someone who had tried to cause harm. In that moment, Derek understood what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with money or power or the ability to intimidate others. As the hallway began to empty, Derek found himself alone with Tyler and Robert, 3 people whose lives had been connected by threads of karma and consequence that none of them could have predicted. The boy who gave away his lunch, the fallen king working as a janitor, and the privileged child whose world had just collapsed. All of them standing at the crossroads of justice and redemption. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rodriguez. Thompson arrested at 3 p.m. Full asset recovery expected. Your name cleared by tomorrow morning. Welcome back to the world, Mr. Harrison. Robert smiled, a genuine expression of joy that his face hadn't worn in 3 years. Justice had been served, his reputation would be restored, and Bradley Thompson would spend the next decade in federal prison paying for his crimes. But as Robert looked at Tyler and Derek, he realized that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines that would follow. The real victory was standing right in front of him. A boy whose kindness had reminded him what was worth fighting for, and another boy who was about to learn that true character wasn't inherited but chosen. The wheels of karma had turned full circle, and tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could yet imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Anderson apartment as Jennifer prepared for what she thought would be another ordinary day of struggle. She moved quietly through their small kitchen, trying not to wake Tyler as she counted the remaining bills in her wallet. $17.32. Enough for groceries to last maybe 3 days if she was careful, if she chose rice over everything else, if she ignored the growing holes in Tyler's shoes for another week. The eviction notice on their refrigerator seemed to mock her with its bold red letters. Final notice, 72 hours to vacate. Jennifer had been picking up every extra shift at Murphy's Diner, working until her feet bled and her back screamed. But it still wasn't enough. The math was simple and brutal. Minimum wage minus rent minus utilities minus food equaled nothing left for the unexpected expenses that kept piling up like storm clouds. Tyler stirred in the next room, and Jennifer quickly composed herself, hiding the worry lines that had aged her beyond her 34 years. She would not let her son see her desperation, would not let him carry the weight of their circumstances on his 12-year-old shoulders. "Morning, sweetheart," she called softly as Tyler emerged from their shared bedroom, his hair sticking up in all directions. "Morning, Mom," Tyler replied, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He moved with the careful quietness of a child who had learned not to make demands, not to ask for things that couldn't be provided. Jennifer packed Tyler's lunch with the same meticulous care she showed every morning, stretching their limited ingredients into something that resembled a proper meal. She had no way of knowing that this routine was about to be permanently altered by forces set in motion weeks ago through her son's simple act of kindness. Meanwhile, across town in a federal holding facility, Bradley Thompson sat in a gray concrete cell wearing an orange jumpsuit that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. His arraignment was scheduled for that afternoon, and his lawyer had already explained the reality of his situation. The evidence was overwhelming, the charges were serious, and his comfortable life was effectively over. Bradley's wife Rebecca had called the night before, her voice hollow with shock and betrayal. She had filed for divorce, taken what few assets hadn't been frozen, and moved back to her sister's house in another state. Their son Derek was staying with Rebecca's family, trying to process the reality that everything he had ever known about his father was a lie. Derek Thompson had spent the night in a guest bedroom that felt like a prison cell, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events at Lincoln Elementary. The image of Tyler's compassionate face kept haunting him, the memory of undeserved kindness offered in a moment of complete humiliation. Derek had tried to hurt someone who had never done anything wrong, and in return, Tyler had offered sympathy and friendship. The irony was not lost on Derek that he was now in the same position as Tyler had always been, dependent on the charity of others, uncertain about where his next meal would come from, wearing clothes that no longer fit the person he thought he was. At Lincoln Elementary, Robert Harrison arrived for what would be his final day as a janitor. He moved through the familiar hallways with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation, knowing that by evening, his true identity would be public knowledge, and his 3-year journey through humiliation and poverty would finally end. But Robert's thoughts weren't focused on his own redemption. Instead, he found himself thinking about Tyler Anderson, the boy whose generosity had reminded him that justice was worth pursuing. Robert had spent the previous evening making phone calls and arrangements, setting in motion a plan that would ensure Tyler's kindness received the recognition and reward it deserved. Agent Rodriguez had called with the final details of Bradley's arrest and the recovery of stolen assets. Harrison Industries would be restored to Robert's control, along with compensatory damages that would make him wealthier than he had ever been before. But wealth without purpose was meaningless, and Robert had found his purpose in the hallways of Lincoln Elementary. Tyler arrived at school that morning unaware that his world was about to change forever. He carried his usual lunch, prepared to continue the routine that had become so important to him. But when he looked for Robert, he found the janitor's closet empty and the familiar figure nowhere to be seen. Confused and slightly worried, Tyler asked Mrs. Patterson, the school secretary, about Robert's whereabouts. "Oh, sweetie," Mrs. Patterson said with a strange smile. "Mr. Harrison had to leave early today. But don't worry, I think you'll see him again soon." Tyler was puzzled by her cryptic response and the way she seemed to be suppressing excitement about something she couldn't share. He went through his morning classes distracted, concerned about Robert and hoping the older man was all right. At lunchtime, Tyler sat alone in the cafeteria with his container of rice, eating slowly as he watched other students enjoy meals from the cafeteria or elaborate packed lunches from home. He saved half of his food out of habit, intending to find Robert later and make sure he had something to eat. Tyler was finishing his meal when Principal Johnson approached his table with an expression Tyler couldn't read. "Tyler Anderson," Principal Johnson said, "I need you to come to the main office. Someone is here to see you." Tyler's stomach dropped, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Had something happened to his mother? Was he in trouble for some reason he couldn't understand? He followed Principal Johnson through the hallways on unsteady legs, trying to prepare himself for whatever crisis awaited. The main office seemed different somehow, filled with a tension that Tyler couldn't identify. Mrs. Patterson was practically vibrating with excitement, and even the usually stern Vice Principal Williams was smiling. Tyler was directed to Principal Johnson's private office, where he stopped short at the sight that greeted him. Robert Harrison stood by the window, but he looked completely different. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. His silver hair was neatly styled, his posture was confident and commanding, and his entire presence radiated the kind of authority that Tyler had never seen before. "Hello, Tyler," Robert said, turning from the window with a smile that was both familiar and transformed. "I think we need to talk." Tyler stared in confusion, trying to reconcile this distinguished gentleman with the humble janitor he had been sharing lunch with for weeks. "Mr. Robert? I don't understand. What's happening?" Robert gestured for Tyler to sit in one of the chairs across from Principal Johnson's desk. "Tyler, I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am. My name is Robert Harrison, and until 3 years ago, I was the CEO of Harrison Industries." Tyler's eyes widened as he tried to process this information. "You mean you're not really a janitor?" "I was really a janitor," Robert said gently. "For the past 3 years, I worked here every night, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. But that wasn't my whole story, just like your kindness to me wasn't the whole story of who you are." Robert sat down across from Tyler, his expression serious but warm. 3 years ago, my business partner stole my company and destroyed my reputation. I lost everything, my business, my home, my wife. I took the janitor job here because this is where my late wife used to teach, and it made me feel close to her memory. Tyler listened in stunned silence as Robert continued his explanation. "I've been working to clear my name and expose the truth about what really happened. Yesterday, the man who betrayed me was arrested by the FBI. His name is Bradley Thompson, and his son Derek is the boy who tried to hurt you in the hallway." The pieces began clicking together in Tyler's mind. Derek's phone call, his devastation, Robert's knowing look when Derek mentioned his father's name. The karma that had been building for weeks had finally reached its crescendo. "Tyler," Robert continued, "your kindness to me came at a time when I had lost faith in humanity. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people worth fighting for. Your generosity gave me the strength to keep pursuing justice." Tyler felt overwhelmed by the revelation, struggling to understand how his simple gesture of sharing lunch could have played a role in such a dramatic story. "I just didn't want you to be hungry," he said quietly. "And that's exactly why you deserve what I'm about to offer you," Robert replied. "Tyler, I want to adopt you." The words hit Tyler like a thunderbolt. He stared at Robert in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. "Adopt me? But what about my mom?" Robert smiled, understanding Tyler's confusion and loyalty. "I don't want to take you away from your mother, Tyler. I want to help both of you. I want to give you the family you deserve and give your mother the support she needs to thrive." Before Tyler could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Principal Johnson opened it to reveal Jennifer Anderson, still wearing her waitress uniform from the diner, her face pale with worry. "Tyler?" "The school called and said there was an emergency," Jennifer said, rushing to her son's side. "Are you hurt? What's wrong?" Robert stood and extended his hand to Jennifer with the same respect he would show a queen. "Mrs. Anderson, my name is Robert Harrison. I have a lot to explain to you, but first, let me say that you have raised an extraordinary son." Jennifer looked between Robert and Tyler, trying to understand the situation. Her protective instincts were on high alert, but there was something about Robert's manner that suggested safety rather than threat. Robert spent the next hour explaining everything to Jennifer. His true identity, his connection to Tyler, the events that had led to this moment. He told her about Tyler's daily kindness, about the way her son had shared his lunch without expectation of reward or recognition. "Your son saved my life," Robert said simply. "Not just by feeding me when I was hungry, but by reminding me that goodness still exists in the world. He gave me hope when I had none left." Jennifer listened with growing amazement as the story unfolded. She looked at Tyler with pride and wonder, hardly able to believe that her quiet, generous boy had played such a crucial role in this remarkable tale of justice and redemption. "What exactly are you asking?" Jennifer said carefully, her maternal instincts making her cautious despite the extraordinary circumstances. Robert reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. "I'm asking for the chance to be Tyler's father and your family. Not to replace what you've built together, but to strengthen it. I want to adopt Tyler legally, which would make you my family as well." He handed Jennifer a document that made her gasp audibly. It was a contract offering her a position as Director of Operations at Harrison Industries, with a salary that was more than she made in 3 years at the diner. "You don't have to take the job," Robert said quickly. "I would provide for both of you regardless. But I thought you might like the opportunity to use your intelligence and work ethic in a career that appreciates your worth." Jennifer stared at the numbers on the paper, hardly able to believe they were real. "Why would you do this for us?" "Because Tyler showed me kindness when I was at my lowest point," Robert replied. "Because he gave freely from a heart that understood generosity despite having every reason to be selfish. Because both of you deserve so much more than life has given you so far." Tyler looked between his mother and Robert, beginning to understand that his simple act of sharing lunch had set in motion events that would change their lives forever. "Mom, what do you think?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Finally, she looked at Robert with tears in her eyes. "Are you sure about this? Taking on a ready-made family is a big responsibility." Robert's smile was gentle and certain. "Mrs. Anderson, I lost my wife and son years ago. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, working as a janitor and living with memories. Tyler didn't just share his lunch with me. He shared his heart. He gave me something to live for again." Jennifer reached out and took Tyler's hand, squeezing it gently. "What do you want, sweetheart?" Tyler looked at Robert, seeing not the powerful businessman or the humble janitor, but simply someone who had become important to him. "I want us to be a family," he said quietly. "All of us together." Robert felt tears prick his eyes as he realized that Tyler's generosity was still flowing, still creating connections and healing wounds that had seemed permanent. The boy who had given away his lunch was now giving Robert the greatest gift of all, a reason to hope for tomorrow. 3 months later, Tyler Anderson Harrison stood in the driveway of a beautiful house in the suburbs, still sometimes unable to believe that this was his life now. The moving truck had just left, and boxes filled with new belongings waited to be unpacked in rooms that belonged to him. Jennifer had excelled in her new position at Harrison Industries, bringing the same work ethic and attention to detail that had kept her family afloat during their hardest times. She and Robert had developed a partnership that was part business, part family, and entirely built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Tyler's well-being. Robert had kept his promise to be a father to Tyler without trying to erase the boy's memories of his biological father or diminish Jennifer's role as his mother. Instead, he had simply expanded their family, providing stability and opportunities while preserving the values that had made Tyler special in the first place. The story had made national news. Billionaire CEO adopts boy who shared his lunch. But the reporters had missed the deeper truth about what had really happened. This wasn't just a story about reward for kindness. It was about how one small act of generosity had created ripples that transformed multiple lives. Derek Thompson had been watching the news coverage from his aunt's house, where he was learning to live without the privileges that had once defined him. His father was serving a 10-year sentence in federal prison, and Derek was working part-time jobs to help pay for his own expenses. The experience of losing everything had been devastating, but it had also been educational. Derek had called Tyler the week after Robert's identity was revealed, expecting to apologize for his behavior and perhaps find some closure. Instead, Tyler had invited Derek to visit, had introduced him to Robert without any mention of the past conflict, and had treated Derek with the same kindness he showed everyone else. "I don't understand you," Derek had said during that first visit. "I tried to hurt you, and you're being nice to me." Tyler had shrugged in his characteristic way. "Being mean to you won't make anything better. Besides, you're going through a hard time. Everyone needs help sometimes." That conversation had led to an unlikely friendship between the boys, built on Derek's growing understanding of what real strength looked like and Tyler's instinctive compassion for someone who was learning hard lessons about life. Robert had offered Derek a job at Harrison Industries, starting in the mailroom and working his way up based on merit rather than connections. Derek had accepted gratefully, understanding that this was his chance to build something honest with his own hands rather than inheriting success built on stolen money. Bradley Thompson, meanwhile, had begun his own journey toward understanding the consequences of his choices. Prison had stripped away the illusions and justifications that had allowed him to believe his crimes were victimless. Letters from former Harrison Industries employees who had lost their jobs and retirement savings because of his theft had shown him the true cost of his betrayal. But perhaps the most powerful letter had come from his own son, Derek, describing his friendship with Tyler and the lessons he was learning about integrity and kindness. Derek had written about working honest jobs for honest pay, about the satisfaction of earning rather than taking, about the way Tyler had shown him what real character looked like. Bradley had wept while reading that letter, understanding for the first time that his greatest crime had not been stealing money, but teaching his son that success could be built on the suffering of others. Derek's transformation was giving Bradley hope that redemption was possible, even for someone who had fallen as far as he had. On a warm spring afternoon, Tyler sat in Robert's restored office at Harrison Industries, working on homework while his adoptive father handled business calls. The office was elegant and impressive, filled with awards and photographs that told the story of Robert's legitimate success. But Tyler's favorite item in the room was a simple plastic container displayed on Robert's desk like a trophy. It was the same container Tyler had used to share his lunch with Robert on that first day, now preserved as a reminder of how small acts of kindness could change the world. Jennifer knocked on the office door and entered with a smile that had become more frequent as their new life had taken shape. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Robert finished his call and stood, straightening his tie. "More than ready. Tyler, how was school today?" "Good," Tyler replied, packing his books into a backpack that no longer needed duct tape to hold it together. "Derek's coming over for dinner tomorrow, right?" "That's right," Jennifer said. "I'm making his favorite pasta. He's been working so hard at his new job." Robert smiled as they gathered their things and prepared to leave. Derek had become a regular fixture at their dinner table, part of the extended family that had grown from Tyler's simple generosity. The boy who had once tried to bully Tyler was now like an older brother, protective and proud of Tyler's continued kindness toward everyone he met. As they walked toward the elevator, Robert paused and looked back at his office, still sometimes amazed by the journey that had brought him back to this place. 3 years ago, he had lost everything and believed his story was over. Now he understood that losing everything had been necessary to find what really mattered. "Tyler," Robert said as the elevator doors closed, "do you ever regret sharing your lunch with me that first day?" Tyler looked up at his adoptive father with surprise. "Why would I regret helping someone who needed help?" Robert exchanged a glance with Jennifer, both of them marveling at Tyler's consistent inability to see his kindness as anything extraordinary. The boy who had changed their lives still considered compassion to be simply the normal way to treat other people. "No reason," Robert said, ruffling Tyler's hair affectionately. "I just wanted to make sure you understood how grateful I am." Tyler smiled his crooked grin, the same expression that had first captured Robert's heart in the school hallways. "You don't have to be grateful for people being nice to each other. That's just what we're supposed to do." As their car pulled away from Harrison Industries and headed toward home, Robert reflected on the wisdom contained in Tyler's simple statement. The boy was right. Kindness should be normal, generosity should be expected, and caring for others should be the default human response to need. But Tyler's example had shown Robert that in a world where such virtues had become rare, the people who still practiced them were precious beyond measure. Tyler had shared his lunch and changed 3 lives in the process: his own, Robert's, and Derek's. The ripples were still spreading, creating waves of positive change that would continue long after the news cameras had moved on to other stories. The universe had noticed Tyler's kindness and responded with justice, restoration, and love. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was that Tyler himself remained unchanged by his reward, still looking for ways to help others, still believing that sharing what little you had was simply the right thing to do. The boy who gave up his lunch had learned that sometimes the smallest gestures create the most profound transformations, and that true wealth comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you're willing to give away.